guys, Jake Carlson here, host of the Modern Leadership Podcast. Are you ready to focus on amplifying your leadership superpowers? Let's go! Hello, fellow achievers. Welcome to another dose of Modern Leadership. It is so good to have you here and part of this experience. You know I love the podcast, and over the past 3 years, I've met some amazing people, guys and gals that are changing the world, building the businesses of their dreams, and taking us on the journey with them. If you've been a listener to the podcast for a while, you may remember today's guest, Matt Miller. Matt joined us back in March of 2016, episode 74 of the Family Before Fortune podcast. He has been an audience favorite, racking up more downloads than almost every other guest. So for those of you who listen to other podcasts, Matt was recently on Smart Passive Income with Pat Flynn and EO Fire with John Lee Dumas. But remember, he stopped here first, and we are glad that he did. Matt, it's awesome to welcome you back. How are you doing today?
I am doing awesome, Jake. Thanks for having me on again. It's good to catch up. And man, it's been neat to hear a little bit about what you've been up to for the last year. And hopefully I can add some more value for the audience as well, because the world has been pretty crazy here also.
Well, and if history repeats itself, you will add tremendous value for the listeners. But before we get too deep into that, let me give those new to the podcast a brief bio of who you are. So Matt spent the first 9 years of his career as an Air Force pilot, and then he went into the private sector. He worked in both the medical device industry and advertising. And while he was a top performer and liked doing it, he knew that his long-term dream, the dream in his heart, was to be his own boss. And I know this sounds like a lot of you listening. It includes myself. So following that, School Spirit Vending was born. Matt, we talked about School Spirit Vending a bunch in our previous episode and all the awesome stuff going on there. I will link that episode in the show notes for this one, but give us just a flavor of what your business is. Fill us in on what's happening since our last chat.
What we do is we offer hassle-free year-round fundraising for schools where we custom design Spirit stickers for the schools with their mascot and colors, and then place custom sticker machines within the school that the kids can buy stickers from, or parents or faculty or whatever throughout the year. That being the foundation of what we do, our business team that we use to serve these schools all across the country is a franchise. And we have about 100 franchise families that we work with today in about 42 states. And SSV provides them an opportunity on a limited time commitment to develop a passive income stream using vending as the foundation, and also to develop a family business where kids and moms and dads can learn entrepreneurship and spend and live life together while running a business.
We talked about this a year ago, but now things are exploding. I mean, from that time until today, things have just gone crazy for you. And so what has happened over the last year that has just been so amazing?
Yeah, Jake, we have added 65 franchisees in the last 14 months. So when you and I last talked, we were just really starting to figure out how best to get our message out and to market and to promote our opportunity as a business. Absolutely exploded. Our team has grown over 125% in size in that period of time.
And what do you attribute that growth to? I mean, where is the growth coming from, or how do you see that success? What's the foundation of it?
I mean, to be honest, I think a lot of it is momentum. But it also didn't hurt to be on some shows like Pat's and John's and yours, like you mentioned. But the reality is, and I think one learning lesson that I've gotten out of all this, Jake, is that you have got to be consistent over a period of time, over an extended period of time. I've been doing interviews now for going on 3 years. I've done 300 plus in that period of time. And, you and I can't predict where our business is going to come from, who's going to be involved, who's going to be a customer, who's going to be a listener. We can't predict any of that. All we can do is plant seeds. And what I've been blessed with the ability to do and the desire to do is to consistently, steadily, boringly continue to plant seeds day after day after day after day to where today, it looks like, man, we have done just some nuts stuff in the last 14 months, but really it's a culmination of a lot of seeds being planted over a much longer period of time.
And I love this concept of the power of consistency. And I'm glad that you brought it up because it's something I like to talk about often on the podcast. One of my favorite books is Darren Hardy's book, The Compound Effect. And are you familiar with that book?
Actually, I just ordered it, believe it or not, because I had it recommended to me from somebody else. I understand the basic concepts, but I've not read the book yet myself.
Well, that's no problem because you're practically teaching the book right now to the audience. And that is, it's the power of taking small, consistent action over time that is going to generate these powerful, positive results into the future. You don't know when you plant a seed, when you come on the Modern Leadership podcast, or when you sit down on somebody else's podcast, you don't know what that seed, what fruit that seed is going to bear. Likewise, for me and my business, when I have you as a guest or when I write a blog post, I don't know where that's going to go, but I do know that consistency and that action leads to momentum, as Darren Hardy calls it in the book, big momentum. And once you start momentum, there is no stopping it. And so, Matt, as you look at your business, you guys have grown tremendously. You've got momentum on your side. You've got this consistency happening. Where do you see yourself going in the future? Do we feel tapped out with 120 franchisees, or do you think there's room for growth?
Jake, first off, we're probably about a year to a year and a half tops away from kind of tapping out things here in the U.S. But we've been doing testing in Canada here over the last 6 months or so. In fact, I'm going up to Calgary this next week for a couple of days to work with a family up there and to help them continue to figure this thing out up in their market. I'm in the process of talking with our attorneys about next steps to potentially do some licensing in other parts of the world. That won't be nearly as hands-on, but it does allow us to continue to expand. But to be honest, aside from that, I've ended up starting a couple of passion projects in the last couple of years that have taken on a life of their own. And I see as kind of the next phase for me and for what we're doing. The first one is, I don't know if I remember, or I don't know if I mentioned the comic book series that I started or hired to have done because I was inspired to read as a kid because of comic books. So I hired a couple of young guys, Baylor University grads. And in the last 3 years, we've put together 10 comic books and 2 full-length novels, 8 comics of which are available online today, and 1 of the novels is available. We recently got picked up by Morgan James Publishing out of New York and are going to be having Marlon and Percy published and in bookstores all across the country, which I'm really, really excited about. And that's going to allow us to continue to inspire kids all over the country and eventually all over the world to read with quality, safe content that the kids love and don't have to be concerned about what little Johnny and Susie are getting content-wise. And then the other is what's called the School Zone School Fundraising Ideas podcast, which I started a couple of years ago. And with School Zone, we are diving deeper with school fundraising companies and providing a resource for administrators, educators, and volunteers in schools who need to raise money for their school. Their exposure to a lot of these companies is typically very limited. And what I love about the podcast is that I can have extended conversations with these people much longer than typically what happens on the trade show floor, and give a lot more background about these companies, what makes them tick, what their drive is, how they got started, and that type of thing. In fact, we just published this last weekend, the 10 Top School Fundraising Ideas Guide for 2017, which is based on the content that we've produced in the last year or so on the School Zone, and have a lot of interest on the volunteer and educator side, but also have a ton of interest from the fundraising company side with what we're doing, because nobody else has thought to do that in the school fundraising space.
And what you're saying is jumping out to me, both the comic book and this podcast, as very novel ideas, very original and unique. And I think that's important for the listeners of this podcast to understand. is that, if you were to pitch this to 99 out of 100 people, they would probably say to you, I don't know if this is going to work. But when you have an idea and you have a passion around it, and you're willing, as we talked about previously, to put in the consistent work, boy, it's amazing the success that you can have. And I love this concept of the school fundraising podcast, where you look at it as an opportunity to sit down with industry experts, potential clients, people that you want to have a conversation with that is literally impossible to do on the trade show floor. And I got to be honest with you, I use this podcast a little bit like that myself. I look at some of the guests that we get on this show, Matt, and it's hard for me to get your time. It's hard for me to call you up and say, Matt, can you give me 45 minutes so we can sit down and get a cup of coffee? But if I can get you on this podcast, boy, I can ask you all the questions that are burning within me, get the mentorship from you, and use it in other ways. And so I think that's the big takeaway that I'm hearing as you talk about your podcast, is you're seeing an opportunity to have a win-win, to gain what you need, but also to provide a service out there. And so I really appreciate you sharing that. Before we jump in, I want to talk to you more about this comic book. But before we do, I got to ask you. So you've been on 300 interviews. You've got these passion projects. You're flying up to Canada to test some new products. You got 120 plus franchisees. How are you getting it all done? I know you're super busy, but how do you keep a handle on it all?
Well, as an example, Jake, the first thing is I learned from John Lee Dumas of EO Fire the power of batching episodes. So with the School Zone as an example, I have done just about every episode for the last year and a half in 3 days, because I've gone to a couple school volunteer events where all these companies were exhibiting. And I pulled them off the trade show floor at dead times, and we did interviews right there on site, so that I'm not having to schedule and do interviews like you and I are doing now, daily or weekly or monthly. Most of the content is being taken care of at one time. And then I've got a team of folks that manage the podcast uploads, the show notes, and then the editing. All I do is give direction as far as what kind of commercial content or whatever other additions need to be made during the editing process. So the School Zone, believe it or not, I've probably spent a total of a day, maybe 2 days tops in the last 18 months actually doing something for the podcast, if that makes sense.
Oh, it absolutely makes sense. And it's
because we've batched. So it makes everybody thinks, holy smokes, this guy, he's Superman. How does he do this? No, I'm not. I've just learned that I have to stay focused on what's most important day to day. And that's the franchise and supporting the schools that we do. But over here on the side, I can hire a couple of guys to do some comic books and give them some direction for 30 minutes or an hour once a month. I can do this podcast over here and batch the episodes and begin to create something there. People oftentimes, Jake, I think, make way too big a deal. And to be honest, oftentimes we let them make way too big a deal about some of this stuff. And the reality is, once you make a decision, you find a way to make it work, and you can get really, really, really creative with your time. And, my focus is on our franchisees 100%, on their profitability, on helping them and support them in every way that we can. To be honest, though, with the comic books and with the School Zone, I actually am supporting them because I'm giving them an education on the industry and who else is out there in our space. And we're also, within the next couple months, going to be rolling out a program where we bring Marlon and Percy into the schools and encourage and inspire kids to read by doing, book readings and some other symposiums and that type of thing that we're looking to do. So there's a lot of, there's a lot of ways all those things tie together. But to be honest, for the first couple of years, I didn't quite know what I was going to do with Marlon and Percy, except for make it available to some of our kids in our schools. And I didn't quite know the direction that School Zone was going in either. But I felt led that these were the right things to do. And because I didn't need to rely on them financially during that period of time, it allowed them to grow organically until I received the inspiration I needed to make them into what they're becoming today, with no pressure on them to bring any money or any financial anything to the table until they're meant to be able to do that. That's what having SSV and the foundation that I've built in the last decade, that's what makes that so powerful. Because I had a period of time where I was laying around the house, taking naps every day, and to be honest, bored out of my mind because I had kind of figured out the time and the money piece with what we were doing. These gave me something to focus on during some of that downtime. And now, like I said, I see as the means for us to take things to a whole new level, serve a completely new audience, and to provide value and to provide significance in the second half of my life to hopefully hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people as time goes on.
Well, I want to take a minute and unpack some of the stuff that you just talked about because there was so much in there, and I'm afraid that some of the listeners probably glossed over it as they got caught up in the story. But a few things I want to pull out. You talk about batching your episodes, and on the podcast of Modern Leadership, we talk about systems, and we talk about the importance of putting systems in place, whether it be batching episodes or if your job isn't in podcasting, can you put a system in place that makes it easy, that you can do it without putting too much thought and effort into it, so you save that mental energy for other projects and other activities that you're working on? The other thing that you talked about is deadlines. When you put a deadline in place, you work to that deadline. Once you make that commitment, I'm going to get a podcast out every Thursday, well, then you work to that deadline. So those are two important things that you talked about with your batching of episodes and the podcast that really jumped out to me. The other idea that I had from that, you talked about times and seasons. You didn't say times and seasons, but that's what I heard, that there are times when you can spend more time doing one thing and you need to put more time doing that, and then times when you can back off. And I see you going into a period, Matt, over the next little bit where you're going to probably need to spend a little bit more time with the comic book because you're moving to the next level. You've gotten it to the position where it is now. To make it grow, you're going to need to put a little bit more time. And that's why it becomes times and seasons of what we're talking about. Does that make sense?
That makes total sense. And I couldn't agree with you more. I'm a gardener, Jake. In fact, right now we are just at the beginning of harvest season here in Central Texas. The winter, things are dormant. There's nothing going on in the garden. And then in January, February, early March, we're preparing the raised beds down the hill to plant. And then we slowly start planting things as the climate and, as it warms up around here. Well, we just a month ago harvested blackberries and then apricots, and now it's peach season. For the next couple of weeks, we are all about peaches and everything that we do, harvesting them, processing them, eating lots of them because they're readily available. And then those we won't have to worry about for another year. But then it's tomatoes, it's peppers, it's onions, it's all these other things that we've planted that are in the ground. And we've learned to live our life in the last 6.5 years here on the farm by those seasons. And so, yes, in the business sense, we're doing the exact same thing and have a little bit more control over when those seasons occur. But you couldn't be more right.
Well, and there's a theme developing throughout this particular episode of the podcast, and that is this seeds and planting. And as we talked about planting seeds, you've been planting seeds for 3 years on different podcasts and different things that you've been doing, people that you've been meeting and working with. And now it's time for you to do some of the harvesting. Well, that goes the same with the gardening that you're talking about, right? You're talking about harvesting blackberries and peaches and tomatoes and all of this, but that's only because months ago you took the time to plant. And so with our businesses, while today may not be the time to harvest, today is the time to plant. And the only way we can harvest in the future is if we spend the time, put our time in today to do all the planting necessary. And so, Matt, one other thing that I wanted to bring up that you talked about through that is you didn't know the direction that some of these projects were going to take. And as you plant seeds, one thing that jumped out to me is new opportunities present themselves. And I recently had a conversation on this podcast about the role of luck in our lives and what luck means to an entrepreneur. And so I think I'll throw it out to you, Matt. For you, what is this luck? How does luck play into the life of an entrepreneur?
Well, first off, Jake, I don't believe any of it's luck. I think the harder that I work, the luckier I get. Somebody said at some point in time that success is where opportunity and preparedness meet. And so I've spent a lot of time over the years learning, studying, attending conferences, developing relationships, and getting in the game of business. And that's the preparedness side, right? And then the opportunity comes along because I've had a little vision. I've taken promptings from what I believe is from God and have followed what I believe his direction is for my life, trusting that this is going to end up being something at some point in time, but along the way, enjoying creating and enjoying doing something new, breaking new ground, that type of thing. And but the key is you've got to be in the game and you have to be preparing. And oftentimes you don't know what you're preparing for, except for that'll be revealed to you in time. I had no idea 13 plus years ago, Jake, that gumball machine that I first bought because my family was hurting so bad financially, I couldn't afford anything else for a business that I could do on top of my corporate career as an advertising executive. I had no way in my wildest dreams to ever think that a $36 gumball machine on eBay would lead to me having, doing fundraising in schools with stickers, would lead to me becoming a franchise, would lead to me having a podcast, to help schools across the country, would lead to me having a comic book company and inspiring kids to read. None of those things tie together looking back, except for I got in the game, I got busy learning and doing, and then I stayed awake for the promptings that came my way. And instead of overanalyzing or thinking too much about it, I just jumped in with both feet and started to figure things out.
Now, what's the difference, Matt, between someone like you that goes on eBay and buys a gumball machine and is able to turn their whole life around, create this business and everything that you're doing today because of that decision, and somebody else that went on probably that same day and bought that same gumball machine from somebody else and is leaving it in their basement full of gumballs? I mean, where is the difference between two people that have make a similar purchase or go through a similar experience and one that takes it and moves on to the next level?
Well, I think a lot of it had to do with what I ultimately wanted to achieve. I mean, to begin with, it was just survival. We needed extra money to live. But I had read Robert Kiyosaki's book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and bought into his idea of passive income and believed that I could make passive income just like he talked about. And for me, I couldn't even afford to buy my own house at that time, let alone buy rental properties, which is a lot of what Kiyosaki talks about. For me, vending was my way to make passive income and ultimately work myself out of a job. So I had a huge goal. I had a huge dream and vision at the time. And that was, I'm sick of working for the man. I'm sick of dealing with corporate politics. I'm sick of being told what to do and when to do it. And I decided that gumball machine, in some way, shape, or form, once I saw that vending really worked, that I was going to leverage that to get free. And all these other things have occurred after that because I believed that I could accomplish what Kiyosaki talks about.
Well, and what I hear is this intentional consciousness. You made a decision, a conscious decision, and I think too many people are just going through the routines. They go to work, they do what they're told to do. They're advertising execs or they're in marketing as you have been in the past, and they just go to work so that they can come home and enjoy the evening and enjoy the weekends. And what you're talking about is being intentional. It's making a decision, and it's not a get-rich-quick scheme. It's being intentional about what you want in the future, putting a plan together that works for you, whatever your circumstances. If you don't have enough to buy real estate, you go out and get a gumball machine, but you make a conscious decision, intentional, to move your life forward. And at that point, then you can start attracting all these opportunities to you. You talk about preparedness and opportunity meeting each other for luck. And I believe that. I also believe, though, that other people are going to have what we would term bad luck. And it's how we react to those situations. It's things that come into our life and how we react to them that really make the difference.
No doubt about it, Jake. I couldn't agree with you more. And a lot of it just comes down to thought process and belief. I believe that we are all endowed by God with seeds of greatness, but it's up to us following him and then putting forth an inordinate amount of work for that greatness to come out. Malcolm Gladwell in his book Outliers talks about working 10,000 hours to be great at anything. Unfortunately, most of us have a microwave mentality about everything in our life today because we can heat up our food and have it available in minutes. We can place an order through Amazon and have something delivered the next day, or in the cities, in many cases, in the next hour or two. And we have become so warped by that thought process that we think that that applies to success in life as well. And that couldn't be further from the truth. So what we've got to do to be successful is so completely different and on the opposite scale of the spectrum of most everything that we deal with day to day in today's technology-driven world, that we have lost touch on what it really means to be successful, what it really takes to be successful, and the excitement necessary to get behind something that over time can amount to something great. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. And there's too many people today that are sprinters, and they need to become marathoners, even though I hate to run, by the way.
And this takes us full circle back to how we started this podcast, which is the power of consistent action. Small steps taken consistently that lead to success. And it's that ability to train for the marathon. And I'm not a big runner myself either, but it's that ability to go out there and put in the hard work, to put in the training, and to do it consistently that prepares you to run the big race. Now, Matt, there's one thing I wanted to ask you. I was excited to get you on the show because we have a mutual friend, Aaron Walker, and Aaron's going to be on the show. Actually, he was on the show a couple of weeks ago, and he had this to say about you. Matt has the incredible ability to see businesses and industries from a unique outsider's perspective. And so I wanted to ask you about that because I look up to Aaron tremendously. I think he's a great leader. And when he says some flattering words about you, I got to ask you about them. Where did you get this ability to see businesses and industries from a unique perspective?
You know, Jake, I think too many of us, we go to school, we get a degree, and we get trained in X. And then for some reason, we're led along the way to think that the only thing that we can ever do in our life is to follow in that lane that college and that degree put us in. That is one of the biggest mistakes, in my opinion, that we can all make, because education really starts after school is over. I believe college has more value really in just people learning to go through a process and to succeed over a period of time, much more so than what we learn there. But so many people say, I'm an accountant, and they spend their entire life being an accountant. Or they say they're going to, they're a financial guy or they're a tech person or whatever, instead of learning as they go and realizing it's okay for me to dip my toe in the water over here, even though I don't have any formal training in that industry. Because most people that are in that industry, the only thing they've got that you and I don't have is just some time in that industry. So when it came to comics, when it came to podcasting, when it came to vending, when it came to school fundraising, all of those are industries that I had no prior experience in whatsoever. I was a history major in college. I was an Air Force pilot. I was an ad executive. None of that stuff had any applicability except for I saw an opportunity. And because I wasn't immersed in those industries for years, like those that have been around in them were, I looked at everything from the perspective of an ad guy and a pilot and a history major, not as a fundraising person, or not as a comic book person, or not as a podcaster. And to give you an idea, I attended my very first International Franchise Association show in January after being a franchise for 18 months. Most people would say, well, isn't that backwards? words, shouldn't you go to the IFA first? No, because I wanted to put my own spin on franchising and build a company in the way that I thought it should be built. And I didn't want to be indirectly influenced and impacted by what I learned by quote unquote franchising industry insiders. So I had enough faith in myself and my ability to learn and the advisors around me that I hired, Aaron, my coach, and others, to have the guts to step out. And even though I may not do things exactly like all these other big franchises that you and I think about when we think about a franchise, that's okay. I don't have to do it like them. I can do it my own way, stay in the same framework. So I didn't go to the IFA until 18 months in, because at that point in time, I learned enough and I wanted to go to the IFA to see where I could get better, where I could improve, where I could provide more value for my team, instead of going there to start to learn the framework to build my company on. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I think as we look at how the listeners can apply this into their own lives, how they can create this ability within themselves, the ability to see from a unique perspective, I think what you're saying is, if I'm an accountant and the only people I spend time with are accountants and we all get together and all we talk about are the same things, well, then there's no benefit, there's no growth happening. In fact, if you and I think and act and feel the same way about things, one of us is irrelevant when it comes to trying to grow our business. And so by expanding our network and looking outside and talking to people who are in a different network, or for example, for us to go out there and be a resource and be a voice of outside perspective for others, that will give us the ability to make different friends, see things from a different perspective, and then take that knowledge, take those learnings and those understandings, and go back and apply them to the principles that exist. For example, we've been talking about accountants, picking on accountants today, Matt, I don't know why. But we go back to our accounting firm and implement some of those ideas in the tried and tested procedures. We're going to stand out. We're not just going to be the same person that gets, punches the clock. We're going to be recognized as someone who's doing amazing things and really changing the face of accounting.
Yeah, exactly. Guys, there's so much opportunity out there. You could, more than you could ever possibly imagine, but you got to be willing to open your eyes. You got to be willing to get out of your lane and not take that degree that you spent thousands of dollars on so seriously. Who cares if you ever use that degree if you're doing what God truly has meant for you to do? And too many of us, we put our blinders on because, okay, I'm going to have to be that accountant for the rest of my life or whatever, instead of realizing we have one life to live. Why not figure out how to live it to the fullest? Why not figure out a way to make money in a way to where you no longer have to depend on it anymore? And then you can truly do what you're passionate about doing instead of what you got to do just to put a roof over your head. I just left a meeting, Jake, before we got together today for an organization that I'm on the board of directors for called Kids Across Cultures. We're planning an annual ride, a fundraising ride called the Tour de Agua in a little town called Dublin, Texas, in Central Texas. And I would have never had time to meet and be on the board of directors of Kids Across Cultures a few years ago, because I was spending the best hours of the best days of the best years of my life having to do what somebody else told me I had to do. Today, I can spend my time where I'm passionate about spending my time, and in many cases don't have to worry about if there's any return financially or otherwise that I'll ever see for that time, because the money thing is taken care of so that I can focus my attentions elsewhere. And I pray that lots more in our society do that and believe that they can do that, because the water's great and it's fun to get up passionate about what you do every day.
So there is the rallying cry from Matt Miller. Folks, rise to your potential. We need you. Get out, do what you're passionate about, make choices, conscious effort to go out and do what you do best, to rise to your potential and be a difference maker. Now, Matt, our time is running just a little bit short here, and there's one last section I want to run through before we let you go. Want to learn a little bit about you, a new section that's different from when we had you on before. Sound like a plan?
Let's do it, Jake.
All right. How about the book currently on your Kindle or bedside table?
The one that I'm reading right now is actually a new one by Tim Ferriss, Tools of Titans. It's about 2 inches thick. It's massive, but it's just snippets from and learnings from hundreds, if not thousands, of interviews that he's done over the years. And there's some really, really, really good stuff in it.
Yeah, if you want to take an hour and a half interview and distill it down to the one paragraph that meant the most to Tim, that's what the book is. So wonderful. How about the best movie ever made?
You know, I don't know if it's the best ever made, but it's one of my favorites. Any of the Lord of the Rings or the Hobbit series. I was a J.R.R. Tolkien fan from an early age, and to finally see those brought to life has been pretty incredible over the last decade or so.
Yeah, it's art. It really is. It's a beautiful piece of art. How about your leadership superpower?
I would say vision and discipline. Just understanding that, you got to, in order to lead, you got to lead by example and being willing to get in the trenches to do that.
How about a motivational quote, philosophy, or mantra?
Zig Ziglar said it best. You help enough other people get what they want and you'll be taken care of. And that's the rule that we've lived by for years in the advertising world, before vending, and now in pretty much everything that we do. And if you can create a win-win for everybody and create huge amounts of value for your customers and the people that you work with, you've got a relationship for life.
And this podcast and my entire business is built on that exact same philosophy. Zig Ziglar, love it. If you could leave just one leadership trait to the next generation, what would it be?
Hard work.
And finally, best book ever written.
The Bible, hands down. I would say another that has a ton of value that most have never read is How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. It's a book written back in the 40s, so some of the stories are outdated, but it is as timely and timeless as ever. And if you haven't read it, you need to pick it up immediately.
And I second that as well. What a tremendous book. Matt, can't thank you enough for your time and coming on the podcast. Before we let you go, any last minute advice, or how can we get in touch with you, find out more about school fundraising?
Jake, I would just tell folks, get in the game. Stop thinking about getting in the game and get in the game. As far as reaching out, if you don't mind, I'd love to share a couple different ways on the comic book side and then on the school side. If you have kids or grandkids or know any kids in your life that you'd like to inspire with some really cool, wholesome stories, you can go to marlandpercy.com, go to the shop, and we've got a 7-comic e-bundle that you can download with the code APEPOWER, APEPOWER. I think you get $10 or $11 off of that bundle. And, will be great, fun content that the kids will absolutely love and help us get the word out about Marland and Percy. As far as vending and SSV, I wrote a short ebook called Live Your Dreams, the Top 10 Reasons Why You Need to Own a Vending Business. And your audience can go to ssvbusiness.com/ML for Modern Leadership and download that for free. At a minimum, learn more about vending and how it might benefit you as a secondary income stream. And if you potentially want to talk a little bit about the franchise and what opportunities might be available there, we can, of course, start a dialogue as well.
Oh, that'll be great. And I'll link all those up on the show notes for this page. Matt, you came back. You're only my second repeat guest, and I really appreciate the time that you spent with us today. Thanks for adding value. Thanks for teaching us about being consistent and the power of consistency. Can't thank you enough.
Thanks, Jake. Appreciate you, man, and God bless.
All right, my friends, the power of consistency. Go out and do the work. Create that momentum that will drive you to success. I love sitting down with Matt because we had him on the show 1.5 years ago, and he was just starting out. He was just building, laying the seeds for his foundation of his business. And here he is today. Fast forward, he's got franchisees running all over the United States, selling stickers out of gumball machines, doing some great things. He's got comic books. He's got a podcast. So many great things going on. And I really appreciate him taking some time out of his day to come and spend with us. The big takeaway that I have for this episode: remember to create systems, to create deadlines, to get things done. If you want to be successful, you got to have a system in place to get it done. You can't just sit on your couch and watch TV all night. If you want to live the dream, you got to work for the dream. And the way that you do that is through small, consistent action over time. Again, everything that we talked about in this episode of the podcast, including how to get the copies of the comic book and to find out how to live your dreams through school spirit vending, all of that will be linked up on the show notes for this episode of the podcast at jakeacarlson.com/ML26. And I look forward to serving you in the next episode of the Modern Leadership Podcast. I will see you next week. But until then, have a great day, make a terrific life, and stay awesome. Thanks for listening to the Modern Leadership Podcast. You can find me on Facebook at Speaker Jake, on Twitter at Jake A. Carlson, and of course the website, jakeacarlson.com. See you there.